Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, which was named by Poets and Writers a best book for writers. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed. And I also have a Substack called Writing That Gets Noticed, where I share clips and craft advice and lots of fun information about publishing, as well as my new live series called Musings on magazines, the story behind the story, which delves into stories that touched my life and others in the 90s and the early aughts when I was magazine editor-in-chief. This brings me to today's episode, talking about decades ago. I met Bonnie Friedman decades ago, and we stayed in touch, and I love to follow what writers and colleagues are doing. And so let me tell you a little bit about Bonnie. Her debut novel, Don't Stop, was recently published by Europa Editions. She is also the author of the best-selling, widely anthologized Writing Past Dark, Envy, Fear, Distraction, and Other Dilemmas in the Writer's Life, named one of the 10 best books for writers by the Center for Fiction and Poets and Writers. She is also the author of 2 memoirs, The Thief of Happiness, the story of an extraordinary psychotherapy, and Surrendering Oz, A Life in Essays, which was longlisted for the PEN Award in the Art of the Essay. Her essays have been selected for inclusion in the Best Writing on Writing, the Best American Movie Writing, the Best Buddhist Writing, and the Best Spiritual Writing. She has taught writing at Dartmouth College, NYU, and most recently, the University of North Texas. Welcome to the program, Bonnie.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Estelle, for having me as a guest.
So can you give a synopsis of what Don't Stop is about? And then I would love to ask you to read the beginning of it, which I think is so propulsive and gets the reader understanding your voice and the context.
Thank you so much. So Don't Stop is about a woman who has a secret life. She is a scholar. She's a very uptight sort of person, and she finds herself becoming involved. She's married. She becomes involved with a man who has an enormous effect on her life. At a certain point, she wants to figure out how to leave him, and it's not so easy.
I love that also she's an academic. She's working on a book about Eugene O'Neill, and there's lots of ties between his life and her life as we go on in the book. And so it's fascinating, and we'll get into all of that. So if you could just read the beginning part, that would be fabulous.
This is the very opening of the novel. When Ina discovered sex at the age of 41, her whole life turned upside down. She found that she liked things she didn't know she could like. Or to be more precise, she found that she craved to do certain things and to have certain things done to her that before this time she would have regarded with mirth and incredulity. Her entire personality had apparently come spring-loaded with a secret compartment in which all sorts of desires lay hidden. Most people didn't know their whole character, she now believed. She certainly hadn't, and she was highly educated and with a wide circle of friends, married at the age of 28 and with a normal dating life before that. Now, events that once struck her as cartoonish or pathetic, a politician caught with a prostitute sucking on his toe, women who wanted to be handcuffed naked to their boyfriend's bed, didn't seem so strange. Now she withheld judgment, and it worried Ina to think that she could quite easily have lived her entire life without discovering this hot, disorienting aspect of herself, as if she'd occupied a dim apartment without ever realizing there was a light switch.
It gets right into the sex, which is an important part of the book, and this woman, Ina, and her desires and her fears and all the parts of her. Now, you wrote Writing Past Dark, and you talked about writers and their fears. And this has a different psychological focus, which is obsession. So tell me about the decision to write about obsession, plus the other things that you write about in the book, and how it's changed or transformed as you kept writing.
One of the reasons I so wanted to be on your program is I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between writing essays and writing a novel. I wanted to write a novel because I wanted to myself have a little less control than I do when I write an essay. When I write an essay, I tend to know my opening and a lot of the way that the piece is going to develop. And I think of it almost as a prosthetic arm to let me reach further in my mind than I would if I get to discover things that way. But for me, an essay is a much more cerebral genre. And I wanted to write about somebody who was out of control. And so I wanted a more immersive experience for the reader. The reason she becomes obsessed, I think, is that she's in such denial about how important this sexual relationship is to her. She's been convinced in her life that the erotic is not that important, that the physical is not that important. She's cerebral and she's an introvert. And she sort of thought, oh, people that do these big splashy things for fun, she sort of thought they were maybe a little inferior to her. And then when she becomes involved in an affair that she doesn't quite have control over, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that she's denied the importance of this aspect of herself to herself. It's hard to leave something. The first step in AA is acknowledging that you're out of control and the importance, acknowledging, stop being in denial. And so she's sort of in denial about a whole aspect of her life.
So psychological issues are important for you to write about, like you like writing about it. Is it because you can let loose in terms of the character in fiction, or is it just you have a real interest in psychology even from the past, and also being a teacher yourself? And I think our connection was from NYU when I taught there in the early aughts.
That is exactly right, because that's when I was teaching there too.
That's how we met.
That's right. I was teaching in the creative nonfiction writing department.
And I was teaching writing for magazines. Yes.
That's how we met. I have always been interested in psychology. I think life to me has so many mysteries to them. When I was in therapy myself at the time of Writing Past Dark, in order to write Writing Past Dark, I entered therapy because I had writer's block. And I found the process of being in therapy so freeing, so useful. I found the theories fascinating. In a bookstore, I will tend to gravitate towards the psychology section or looking at the table of contents. Even the New Yorker recently came and there was one article about a woman overcoming grief at the sudden loss of her husband and the method that she used to do that. And I found that so very fascinating. And I think before I discovered the discipline of psychology, I didn't have a way to understand my own life. I didn't know what had happened, why I was this way. So to me, it's enormously useful. And I think one of the challenges of writing this novel was to not bring the theory in. I wanted the reader to become immersed. And to do that, you can't be explaining things. The part of me that wanted to do that I had to fend off in order to bring the reader more deeply into the experience.
What's interesting to me is this is clearly about obsession, about sex. When you told me that you had a novel about a woman and sexuality, I was thinking it was going to be more erotica, but really the story is what drives the sex, I guess. And so I felt like everything was in service to the storytelling as I read it. It didn't feel like straight erotica at all, even though there is a lot of sex in the book. Can you talk about the techniques that you used or how you made sure to do that, focus on the storytelling?
In an early draft of the book, I had always meant sex to be at the center of this because it allows this woman to have certain epiphanies about her life. She thinks she has a good marriage, but she discovers in her relationship with this guy that in fact there are levels of intimacy that she just sort of had no idea about. So I did want the sex itself to be revelatory for her.
She was sort of in the dark. I mean, to paraphrase your other book, she was in the dark about her relationship with Simon, her husband, like little revelations. I guess as she kept being involved with Jack, she started realizing things that Simon wasn't giving to her. And also, she makes the decision to have an affair on her marriage, which I thought was she didn't seem to have a lot of guilt about it, or maybe in the beginning she didn't.
It's true. She does not have a lot of guilt about it. I think in part because she's in denial that it's really actually happening. I mean, to her, it has the quality of being a movie. It has the quality of some television show that she's watching. And I think that that is often the nature of denial, that people say, oh, my real life is my life with my children, if they have children, and my family and my job. And, that's what I respect. And this other thing that's happening on the side is just kind of frivolous and not that important. I have to say, technically, one of the challenges in writing a novel is if one wants to have a character who realizes things later on and doesn't realize them early on, that's a technical challenge. I needed to portray the marriage and portray her thinking it's really good, and the reader starting to realize maybe in advance of the character, oh, there's certain important things lacking that she just doesn't know about. And then by the end to have her discover that. And I think that was one of the challenges of writing the novel, is figuring out how do you convey that to a reader. You don't want her to know at the outset what the problems are, because that just would change the dynamic of the novel. It would make her seem like a horrible person, or why doesn't she just leave him right away? So the marriage to her had to seem good enough, but over time she discovers what's lacking, and she's frightened to discover that. And I think that's often the way in life. People would rather have stability. They don't want to know the problems. They deny the problems. They want to wait out the problems. Most people do not want to explode their lives.
Yeah, there's an interesting dichotomy because she's exploring her passions and the things that she denied herself or didn't even know she was denying herself. And she's also an academic, as you are. So, how did you come up with the idea for the novel?
I've always been interested in women with secret lives ever since I was very young. I remember reading in New York Magazine about a woman who was a street photographer, and her family didn't know that. She had a very conventional bourgeois life, but as soon as the children left for school and her husband for work, she changed her clothing and she was out living this kind of gritty existence, like the kind of Diane Arbus thing. And I always was interested in people that had very divided lives. So I wanted to portray that, and what are the tensions in that. People with secret lives.
Yeah, I love that it's, about sex, about obsession, the psychological, framed around a woman, an academic, doing research into Eugene O'Neill, and then finding out different things, like when he went to recover from tuberculosis and the epiphanies that he had, almost the same time that she's having different epiphanies about her life. And so it adds a literary element as well to the novel. So it's really a mixture of so many different elements. How did you come up with Eugene O'Neill? Is that somebody you had studied when you were younger, or how did that work?
That is such a great question. It's a question that Ina is asked in the novel, like, why are you studying Eugene O'Neill? And I have to say, it was a gut impulse. When I think about it, I loved Long Day's Journey into Night. I love this portrayal of the family. And I think I recognized my own mother a little bit in the mother in that story, who's a figure of great pathos. You feel quite terrible for her, even though she's a drug addict, but she has an enormous vulnerability to her. And I was very interested in that. And then, too, I wanted my character to study somebody I myself didn't understand so that I could learn with her. So that's why I didn't choose somebody like Tennessee Williams, who I feel a much greater affinity towards, or Arthur Miller, I thought of. But Eugene O'Neill is stony, difficult. I think it was that the very fact that I didn't understand him that made me think, wow, that would be great to put him in my novel and give me occasion to study him.
I love that framing. How long did it take you to write this?
I've been working on this book a very long time, certainly over a decade. I must say that during that time, I got a tenure track job and I wrote nonfiction because I needed to stay in that genre to get tenure. In the summers, I'd be working on it, and every winter break, I'd be working on it. It took me a long time, in part because I needed how to learn to transition from writing essays to writing a long narrative. There are certain traits from writing essays that I needed to unlearn. For instance, at the end of every chapter, I would come to a resting point, the way one does with an essay, that there's a sense of resolution. And with a novel, a sense of resolution is kind of your enemy. You know, you want to keep the pages turning. So you can't end a chapter with a sense of resolution. If there's going to be a sense of resolution, you have to sort of tuck it in further in order to keep the energy going. You know, I think that's why it took me so long.
So, was one of your tactics in writing like ending a chapter in a certain way to lead the reader onto the next chapter? Can you share some of those tricks?
Yes, you know, one of the things I learned was to cut it off sort of almost before I was ready to, like let a chapter, you know, in a bit more of both suspense, but also a sense of things are unresolved. And then I would tuck, or I would jump the action forward at the beginning of the next chapter and then tuck the resolution action into maybe the third paragraph of the next chapter. So that was, you know, one thing that I learned to do. You know, reader needed certain information. Don't necessarily give it in sequential order, but let the next chapter jump forward and then give that information so that the reader gets what they need. Like there's a certain part where the book jumps many weeks forward, and then in a flashback, I give what had happened in the meantime.
Towards the ending, right? Towards the ending, it does that when she's had the time to reflect and things have happened.
Right, that's right. That's right. It was a lot of fun too. This is something else that was fun to do, is to let her situation get more and more perilous. It was actually a suggestion of my editors who said, what if she blows past all her deadlines for this book that she needs to write on Eugene O'Neill? And that is so unlike me. It would never have occurred to me, but it was great in terms of keeping up the sense of this character is out of control, and we see that she's doing something dangerous and she's in denial of that.
How did you come to this publisher? How did that happen?
This is the most amazing story to me. The way I came to this publisher was that my friend Sally Randolph published a beautiful book called The Uses of Art. And to thank all the different people who had helped her with the book, I had been a reader of the book and I had given her a blurb for the book. She had a dinner party. It was the first dinner party first party I'd been to in a long time. It was the first one where I took off my mask. And I happened to be sitting across from a very nice gentleman who I had never met before. And we happened to start talking about Eugene O'Neill, about whom he was interested, and I know a great deal about because my character is researching Eugene O'Neill. And at the very end of the dinner party, he said, if I could ever be of use to you, let me know. I didn't even know quite what he meant by that, but he turned out to be an acquiring editor at Europa. And I sent him the first 2 paragraphs of the novel, which I read to you. And he said, why don't you send me the rest? And that was like on a Sunday. And on Wednesday, he said, I've read the first 13 chapters and I'm going to keep going. And then by Saturday, he emailed me and he said, I'd like to have Europa make an offer for the book. So it was not through my agent.
Oh my gosh, I had the same situation. I met the editor for New World Library for my writing book, and it wasn't, I got an agent after too. So
it's so, you know what? There's a lot of things to learn from that. One is that agents don't necessarily know what editors are going to want. So a writer might get many rejections from an agent, and yet actually there's a market for it. The power of the gatekeepers is very intense. The other thing is that if I had known he was an acquiring editor, I would not have had the time that I did. I didn't know that, so it was to my benefit. But it really shows that even we who are very shy should get out there to the extent we can, be in the swim of things. It's worth it, even if it feels, I never like going to things like that.
And we saw each other recently that was at AWP, and I was moderating a panel on literary as opposed to consumer writing, and I saw you there, and that's where you told me about your book. I love the connections, the impromptu connections that we find, and also the reconnections.
And then to realize that writers are a resource for one another. I had so many novelist friends help me with the book and give me very good ideas. I knew that my character at the end needed to evolve, and I didn't quite see how, what was the next step for her. And I had a friend who challenged me on, she hasn't quite gotten there. She seems too childish at the end. I had to really work very hard, and my friend Alice Stark helped me achieve an ending that now I feel is the right ending for the book. So I guess I also wanted to say our writer friends are just such resources.
Absolutely. And the way that you end, it's in a very literary way, like the words are very pretty. And you also think kind of beyond the book, like where she's going to go. Do you feel that there's a part 2 for Ina? Or are you ready to move to another character? Or do you want to go back to nonfiction? What is it?
I am so ready to move to another character. I have another novel that I started writing. One of the things I must say that I love about this ending is that I think it leaves open, like she thinks she knows what she's going to do. It's somewhat open-ended.
Well, Bonnie, this has been such a pleasure talking with you and everybody. I don't have the proper cover, but don't stop. And you can see all my post-its. And she has the cover, and just such a joyful and psychological and propulsive read that you just turn the pages because you feel like you're immersed. I think that's a great word to use in Ina's life and the life of those characters around her. So thank you.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Estelle.
Follow me at EstelleErasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.